Thanks for the introduction, Steph. I've been working for the Murraylands and Riverland Landscape Board for about 8 years now. And at the moment, I've been working on a native grassland project along with Kate Graham, and that's funded by the National Land Care Program. So just acknowledging that from the start, it's provided the resources for us to do this project, and I've picked out the bits that I thought might be of interest to this group today. So we'll see how we go. It's going to be quite different from the other talks that you've had, but that will be fine. And certainly there's lots of nice pictures to have a look at too when you go through. So hope you enjoy. So what I'm going to talk about today, I'm going to introduce what our native grasslands in South Australia are like. That's from a conservation point of view. It's a threatened community. We'll talk a bit about that, but then I'm going to park that and I'm going to totally turn on to looking at native grasslands as pasture, but basically building on the lessons and things that we've learned over the last 5 years of this project. So that'll include looking at how they function as pasture, what to expect from native grasslands rather than other more traditional pastures, and the things that we've picked up about some tips about how to try and manage it sustainably. So first of all, an introduction. We have in South Australia, our native grasslands are called irongrass natural temperate grasslands. It's a ecological community, and there's not a whole heap of it left, but where it actually still exists in our region is in this sort of long north-south sort of span from Tailem Bend up. Well, we've worked up to sort of about Peterborough, and it heads off out of the region as well further. But the areas that you can see on that map there is basically not the whole extent of it, but basically the properties that had some native vegetation mapped on them. So you can really see how there's not a great deal of it left. Just got a photo there of the project team. Myself, we've been working collaboratively with Andrew Fanny from Seeding Natives, Anne Brown, who's a native veg consultant in the Mid-North, and Amy Linky from Mid-Murray Land Care, and Kate, who's bending over the quadrat there. So the main thing, I guess, I'm not going to talk much about exactly what we've been doing for our project, but basically build on what we've learnt from these 5 years of doing a whole heap of vegetation survey, which has been such a boon for this project. I've got a great audience here now from work as well as the community, but sometimes people think that this is a waste of time to go out and do that sort of survey, but it has just been fabulous, a great way to start, great conversation starter, ringing, cold calling farmers to ask, have you got this on your land? Can we come and have a look? And we met a heap of people, particularly in 2018 to start off. I think we had 60 farmers. One said they didn't want us to come, and 59 said that was fine, and we were really rapt with that. And so we got to see all of the different types of native grasslands across that area, where different conditions, different types of plants, different areas, and that has really benefited us to see what this particular type of vegetation can look like. So what is it in the first instance? Because it can look, especially a lot of the year, it's just brown and dried and frizzled. But so this is a spring photo, but it's way more than just grass, and more than just a bunch of plants together. And that's, I guess, I'm going to get nerdy now into the ecology of what the grassland is actually made of. So you can see here that there's a number of different types of plants. I'm going to go through them, but it's a whole big mixture of not just different species, but different types of plants that work in different ways. We'll all know the difference between annual and perennial plants. Well, I'm going to break it down even further. More than just grass. The main sort of key species that you have out there is, the scientific name is Lomandra. There's 2 different types. They're generally about this high. That's a shot down in Tailem Bend, and the common name is irongrass over here. It's different in other states, but they call it irongrass, so that's why we call this the irongrass native grassland of South Australia. This plant is like the skeleton of this type of pasture. It's not very palatable, and so sometimes it gets a bit underrated, but those plants, they're huge, and you can imagine what a habitat value that they have, protection from native animals. Certainly farmers have also told us that their lambing rates are higher in areas that have got these iron grasses. They're very tough. They're very hard to germinate. and to try and get to grow, because they're not very good at doing that's not their life strategy. Their life strategy is to live for 400 years and not die, and that's basically what they do, and they really have to suffer quite a lot for them to drop off. But the other thing you think about, not just all the animals and lizards and butterflies and all sorts of things that live there, but they're also great habitat for collecting the seed of all the other plants around. So you'll see some photos in the talk that look pretty crispy, because the first 2 years of the project in 2018 and 2019 were a pretty sorry sight out there. But these native grasslands were hanging on. They were a bit brown, but they were quite fine, sitting there waiting for when the rains came. And that's what's the benefit of this particular plant. So sometimes that's a good thing for us to remind some landholders that don't sort of see value in this, to realise, well, they're actually really good at helping that whole pasture, if you like, to hang on. So we've also got perennial herbs. In grasslands, you've got heaps in the daisy family. There's heaps of them, so there's a lot of yellow daisies in particular, all different sizes and shapes. We've also got annual herbs or ephemerals. The difference, I think, pretty important too, for those interested, that an ephemeral basically is not just like an annual will grow at the same time each year, but ephemeral will be opportunistic. So they might not grow some years when there's really not enough rainfall at all, and then they might grow at a different time depending on when a large rainfall event comes. And that's a great strategy for because these plants are tiny, really tiny, and we get pretty excited when we see a nice big diversity of them. And they have a really important role as well in dry, lower rainfall areas. I should have said that most of the area where we've been working is probably more in your 350 to 500 mil annual rainfall, and the farmers will tell you they're not getting that anyway. They're getting less than that. So yeah, it's pretty dry out there. But these things come up most years anyway when the dew starts to fall heavier, even before the break of rains, or when we're just getting to that point. So they've got this little, they're not very competitive, as you can imagine, because they're so tiny, but they're the first thing to sort of wake up and get going and germinate. And then they're holding that soil together waiting for the plants that are coming, which is more of the grasses, when you get the rains coming in, and they take over. So everything's got a place. Lilies are another really important one. Sometimes there's not that much going above the ground, and it's a bit of a hard sell to tell a farmer that this might be a useful thing in their pasture. But they are really important. They are nutritious, and they certainly are. They do get eaten preferentially from other plants, but also they've got lovely big juicy tubers under the ground as well. And we'll talk about that as we get underneath the soil later on in the talk. But they are a really important group of plants, and certainly they were what the First Nations people were farming in a lot of instances, is the tubers for a lot of these plants. In fact, you might be able to see up here, that's actually, I've snuck that in, it's not a lily, it's a yam daisy, but that's what's going on under the ground, these great big fat juicy tubers that are taking up space in the soil and are a really good strategy for when you're getting through a dry time. They just hold that starch there and their energy, and then they're ready to go when the conditions come back right. Shrubs. I used to work in Victoria for about 14 years on native grasslands, and there were no shrubs in the grasslands. And it was dead flat because it was on the volcanic plain. So yeah, this was something that really surprised me. Another really important component of a grassland is to have shrubs as well. And when you have more of those saltbush chenopod type plants as well, they are fantastic feed. They're really good for stock gut biology as well. So there's really good reasons. I didn't think 15 years ago I'd be saying there's great reasons to get stock to eat native vegetation, but now I can see that, yeah, that's actually really good crossover there, where the benefit of these native plants and these families of plants like your salt bushes are actually really good for stock. And then finally getting to the grasses, I've split that up because there's two different types of native grasses, or grasses at all, based on when they sort of grow. We have winter grasses, or they call them C3 grasses, and they tend to grow at higher rates when it's cooler and less rainfall. And then you have the C4 grasses, which we call summer grasses, and they are kangaroo grass is sort of one of the most known ones, but in South Australia actually there's a lot more of a diversity of these C4 plants than there is in Victoria, which is interesting, and I wonder if that's because it is drier over here as well, and some of it is about the grazing impact as well. But yeah, there's a lot of different C4 grasses, and they're fantastic because they might not come up every year when it's dry, but if you just get enough rainfall, you will get through the summer live, healthy, native perennial grasses growing, and a lot of these look like pretty good feed to me for stock. So they're really important as well. So this is part of the area. I'm standing up on one of the ranges in the mid-north, and basically on the hills where we've got wind farms and we've got some of the native grasses hanging on in those rockier areas, and then in the swales in between where you've got your deeper soils, those areas have obviously been taken over for cropping, agriculture, and that's why these systems are critically endangered, and that's worldwide, not just in South Australia. Obviously areas where they're sort of more treeless and open and got productive grasslands have been really good areas to go out and do this for. So yeah, we've been looking for some of the areas where this type of vegetation is hanging on, and keeping in mind that often when we find it, it's not in the prime condition. They're often in the areas where it's just hanging on. One of my dreams, going off topic a little bit, I'd love to try and actually, second a paddock and try and grow a native grassland and show people what they really could look like, especially with wool prices and, grazing becoming, more of a positive thing to do now, and financially as well, that we don't even really know just how good they could be, because the things that we're looking at now are the stuff that's on the rockier, more hospitable areas. Anyway, that's the end of the ecology nerdy plant talk, which well, it might not be because I'll probably keep diving back into that, but now I'm going to totally switch over. I haven't done this before, so feedback at the end will be fantastic. But yeah, I'm really going to turn that part off and just, I'm not even going to go on about the dual benefits, which there certainly are dual benefits, but we're just going to talk about these native grasslands and how they function as pasture. And really with the team that we've had, and we've had 5 years of going up and having a look at these systems with the sheep, because again, most of the area where these grasslands are persisting are on sheep properties. They're being grazed. So we're very interested in talking to the farmers, finding out how they value these things, how it runs, how they work. But this is some things that we've come up with, some suggestions about what we've learnt from it basically. So I want to talk about plant diversity. I want to talk about some implications for soil biology. This is themes, no data. What to expect, I suppose, from a native pasture, and the last section as well to look at, what are some of the tips that we've kind of picked up for managing these areas sustainably. So, I can hardly read that. Healthy grassland, I've got, it's not a monoculture. So one of the most important aspects of a native pasture is it's got a really high diversity, and often people think about pastures with high diversity, or certainly with crop grazing, have got more like sort of 8 species, but in these healthy grasslands we have, even in any of the grasslands, we've generally got at least 15 different species, but in a lot of the better sort of quality areas, they've got more like upwards of 40, 50 different species of plants. And it's not all about the different species, like I said, it's about the different types of plants. They have different form, they grow in different times of the year, their root systems are different and functioning at different times as well. So that diversity is a key outcome for our project, learning about why these ecosystems can thrive in a pretty dry, inhospitable climate and still come up like that when they have a good rain. This is also a really common site. This grassland is missing quite a lot of different types of plants there. There's none of the irongrass there. There's no C4 or summer grasses there. That's all different spear grasses and some wallaby grass. But there's still a lot of other herbs down the bottom. So it's still quite diverse, even when we've lost a lot of those other types of plants. So there's a lot of country out there that looks like that as well. So now, why is the diversity important? So this is some drawings of things that look more like Australian native plants here. The diversity is important for quite a number of reasons. One of them is just spatially. Some of the plants are tiny, some are big, some are broad, and having that diversity of different types of form of plants means that they've all got a space and they can all live together. Also, if you look at through the seasons, of course, like I was saying, the little tiny things often come up first, then you get the C3 grasses, and then you tend to get the perennial herbs sort of going. The lilies don't really come out till like October, November, and then you've got the summer grasses which go after that. And so you haven't got one type of plant that's going all through that season. You've got quite a number of different plants are there that are contributing to the term that I'm learning from our landholders is more about looking at that year-round green. Putting more of the plants that grow at different times of year, can you actually get that year-round green extending for a longer period of time? So there's those reasons. Spatially throughout your paddock, it means you've got lots of different types of plants. Through the seasons, you have it different as well. And the changing climate aspect is really important as well, because these plants are adapted to dry, harsh conditions. And so you'll get different types of plants will thrive when it's dry, as compared to when you have high rainfall areas, you'll have then another suite of different species, and that gives it options. And I guess that's a key message that we often talk about. Having diversity gives resilience because you've got options for whatever the seasonal or even annual conditions are. The other reason why it's important, of course, when you look below the ground is you've got a diversity of different root types for the same reason. Different depths, different spaces. Some of them are more tuberous sort of roots, and those roots can all collaborate again because they're not all living and thriving at the same time. It gives you that longer growing period of live roots in the soil. And as we've been learning already, live roots in the soil mean a healthy soil biology as well, because that's what's feeding all of these microbes and bacteria and fungi is the carbon that's coming down through the roots, which I will talk about as well. I guess the main thing that we're looking at too about having these live roots in the soil is how do you actually get that carbon down into the soil, and how does that function sustainably over time without having to do anything to it. So the solar energy gets captured through the leaves, the solar panels, and that gets converted into sugars and ends up going down through into the roots. And then the thing that is most amazing is that they're a leaky system. The roots leak, the carbon and the sugars come through and exude out of the roots, and then it's those sugars and that are feeding all of that soil biology. And so that's incredibly important because that's what's supporting the soil biology, creating the soil aggregates and creating the carbon lattices that help improve soil moisture capacity, soil water holding capacity. So that's incredibly important. I actually just whacked these in here too because I thought it would be a nice discussion point for later on. This is more what I gathered from listening to quite a few of Christine Jones's talks. She's a very engaging speaker as well about soil biology, and it came up before, and I thought it's really interesting to have a look at the different types of carbon and the difference between the carbon that you get when you have the leaf litter, like if you're looking at stubble or breaking down leaf litter at the, on the surface. That type of carbon is different than the type of carbon you get through that pathway of the energy and the sugars going down through into the roots and having those root exudates come out, and then those root exudates that go down through the roots are used by the decomposer fungi and the bacteria. And interesting statistic there is that 2/3 of the carbon that's sequestered in the soil comes from these root exudates, not so much from the litter that's falling at the top. So yeah, I guess that's, for me, the most important, especially out in these native grasslands where you're looking at having perennial vegetation and trying to have soil biology being healthy all through the year in dry times as well as wet times, then you really do need to have these living roots that are there providing a food source for the soil biology all the way through. Because if you stop having a period where you have the live roots, then where's the feed for the mycorrhizal fungi and all the fungi and the bacteria as well? So I think that's really interesting. So yeah, diversity of plants, essentially, going back to that, is essential to have those live roots all through the growing season. So moving on then, the benefits of native grassland pastures. The grasslands in South Australia are naturally adapted to low rainfall, There's quite a lot of different types of native grasslands in Victoria and Tasmania, and some out in the ACT. And they're all a little bit different, but certainly the grasslands that we've got in South Australia are right on the edge of the lowest area of rainfall. So they are particularly adapted to low rainfall. They include a substantial cover of perennial grass, and this is interesting because up in the area where we've been working, like I said, in the mid-north, in those lower rainfall areas, none of the introduced grasses are perennial, and all of the native grasses are perennial. That makes sense. So if you want perennial grasses in this area in the low rainfall, you are looking at native grasses. And people have tried to introduce rye, cocksfoot, all different types of perennial grasses and perennial forms of those grasses, and it hasn't worked. So there's a real benefit in trying to understand how to grow good perennial native grass plants up in this area. They can persist through droughts, and they can end up, looking pretty crummy by the end of a drought, but it's there ready to go. The root system's there ready to go, and they can respond really quickly to breaking rains. They provide cover and they prevent erosion when they're managed sustainably. And the diversity of plants helps to feed the soil biology all year around. So these are really resilient systems, these native grasslands. This is just the last part of my talk where we're picking out some of the things that we've seen from all of those different areas of native grasslands where we've been working. So these aren't instructions for you. These are just kind of thinking about things for farmers that have got native pastures. And I've just, put these statements out there. But don't graze too hard is really important. That often happens, and if you graze the grasses right down to the ground, it takes a really long time for them to recover from that. It's not doing you any favours. So that's one thing to remember. The rest period is also really essential as well. So, and I've got a diagram to demonstrate this as well. Again, so in this diagram showing that if you, say for grazing, or it could be a fire or something else that causes that disturbance, if you lose the biomass off the top of the grasses, the first thing that happens is that the solar panels are gone, and so you lose the root mass. It reduces dramatically, and it sits there like this. The first thing that happens, and it stays there for quite a while like that, and when you get good conditions again, the leaves start growing first, and these solar panels are essential because they then have to build the root ball up again. But one of the things that happens is that people see this, grass start growing and think, right, well, it's ready to get the animals back on, but that's a really bad time to put the animals back on, because the only way you can get your root mass bigger is to get the energy down into the roots like we were talking about. So that's not the good time, and this is the benefit of giving it a bit more rest. And basically, the harder that they get grazed, the longer period of time you need after that for these grasses to be able to respond. So I think there's some merit in having a look at maybe trying to graze them not quite so low, and then the rest period will be shorter as well. So having those brief grazes and then a rest period is ideal. Another way of looking at it too is to look at that you're managing your pasture using your stock and not the other way around. So the other thing, these systems, like I've been saying, are quite resilient and really good through a drought, but once they're gone, it's really hard to get them back. In fact, I would say it's pretty much impossible. Like I said, the iron grasses, we're growing them in tube stocks and putting them out on some of the conservation parks, and they're still not loving it, and heaps of them die. They're just not very good at germinating from scratch. And you can see that there'd be a difference between new plants trying to grow in this area here, which would be a lot easier. They've got shelter, they've got the good soil biology. But once you get a really open area, it's really hard to try and sow that. And we're trying some of that in our trials, but it's actually really hard to do. So keeping your perennial plants is of the utmost importance. Get to know the best time to put the stock on, and most importantly, when to take them off. So that's another really important part, and that requires, having transport and water, having somewhere to put the animals and all that sort of thing. But that's something that we do see. People are trying to do a pulse graze and then get their animals off, but sometimes there might be a reason why they can't get the animals off exactly when they want to, and then it just does this irreversible damage, and a lot of those perennial plants end up dying, and it's no good. So I think that it's almost more important to think about, exactly when you're going to get them off. Needing to have a sacrificial paddock or a containment area on hand is really important so that you can do that and get them off and have somewhere else to put them and feed them. And there's another comment back down there, because we get that some other time too, is people think that if you're leaving sort of green material in the paddock, that's sort of wasted feed, and then it's absolutely not wasted feed though. That's your capital. Anything that you see that's out in the paddock that's still got green in it are the solar panels, and that's what's going to be actually building your plants again. To be strategic, so there's not many places that just have native grasslands up there. They're often quite a mix, so they'll have cropping and they'll have other grazing paddocks as well. So I think that I'd love to say that the native grasslands are, just as productive as the others, but sometimes they're not. You'll get, your pulse of your oats and those sorts of things in winter, and that's actually a lot more productive than the native grasslands. But what the native grasslands have got going for them is, like I say, resilience. They won't have that big pulse of production and feed value, but they will be there all year round, or most of the year round, depending on how dry it is. But they're a lot more resilient and reliable. And the other thing that you can get too, like I said, because you've got all those summer grasses, if you happen to get, some storms or good rainfall in the dry time in January, February, and we had that happen with one of our field days a couple of years ago. We didn't think it was going to be looking that good, but they'd had some rain, 10 days beforehand, and the whole area just gets transformed really quickly. I mean, they've got these dormant grasses there, established root systems ready to go. And so some people that do have these systems with the C4 grasses, and they get a good rainfall like that, they can just pop their sheep back out there and get a good graze and make the most of that as well. So that's another good way to use them. This doesn't actually happen very often, but it's really bad to supplement feed in these paddocks. Again, because if there's not enough feed in the paddock, the stock just shouldn't be in there, because they will just eat out the things that you won't be able to get back, basically. So that's a really important one. Other common ones we've had farmers ask us about adding fertiliser. Some people think that fertiliser is not good for native plants. It's not actually not good for them, it just doesn't benefit them as much because they don't grow as fast. But what it does is it improves the growth of the things that you don't want, basically. And so if you end up getting more of those introduced annual plants, will really love the fertiliser. And they'll grow really well in that short period of time, but what they'll do is they'll push out the other plants. You end up transferring from being a nice healthy native grassland to areas with heaps of weeds in them that look fantastic for a month or two and then are completely dead for the rest of the year. So that's the reason why we don't recommend fertiliser on native grasslands. And similarly, we don't recommend spraying with insecticides either, and that's another thing, because the native ecosystems have a really good balance of different types of insects. They've got a lot of your pollinators. I saw a paper from the CSIRO a little while ago that showed that there was a real benefit for having native bushland or grassland, native ecosystems next to cropping systems, because they do have a lot more of your pest predators in the native ecosystems. And if you've got a crop nearby, that means that they can come and get rid of any of your pests in your crops very quickly as well. So there's real benefits in keeping them there. And I think this is my last slide. There's no set formula, and I guess that's something that we've had to learn from this. A lot of people want to know what's the formula of when you should put animals on and off. There's a lot of talk about high density, short duration grazing, but it's not something you can do in a timed way. There really is no getting away from the fact that the best thing is to understand the pasture and to be able to make your own decisions, not based on the calendar, but based on how your pasture is actually looking. So manage for the longer term, hence getting the animals off when you need to, assessing the pasture regularly and learning how it responds, making the most of that available feed like I was talking about, but then just getting them off when you need to as well and protect the health of the plants. After a drought or heavy grazing, give the pasture a significant rest to just let those root systems respond and grow before you put the animals back in, and to encourage a diversity of plants to help feed the roots in the soil all year round. I think I was correct. Thank you.